It started with a swamp, a dream, and a man who refused to let anyone tell him it was a bad idea. What grew out of that Florida flatland became the most visited theme park destination on Earth. This is the entire story of Walt Disney World. The idea that wouldn't die. Walt Disney had already built Disneyland in Anaheim, California, and watched it become a phenomenon, but he also watched what happened around it. Motels, fast food joints, souvenir shops, all springing up on land he didn't own, cashing in on everything he'd built. Walt hated that. The park drew millions of people, and most of the money they spent on the surrounding area went to everyone but Disney, so he started thinking bigger. The concept of a second, far larger Disney park had been floating around since the late 1950s. Walt wanted full control this time, not just the park, but everything surrounding it. He envisioned something called Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Not a theme park, an actual city, a functioning, futuristic urban environment where people would live and work, powered by the latest technology, managed by American industry, and essentially free of the inefficiencies Walt associated with traditional government. Whether it would have ever worked is another question entirely, but the ambition was completely characteristic of the man. He set his sights on Florida. The climate was warm year-round, the land was flat and cheap, and the population of Central Florida was growing fast. Tourism to the state was booming thanks to the space program at Cape Canaveral, drawing attention to the region. Walt visited in person, reportedly flying over the landscape and deciding immediately that the area near a small city called Orlando was exactly what he needed. In the early 1960s, Walt's team began the work of acquiring land, quietly, through dozens of shell companies with names like MT Lot Real Estate and Reedy Creek Ranch. The identities behind the purchases were carefully obscured. They didn't want anyone finding out it was Disney buying up the swamp, because the moment that got out, prices would skyrocket. Every landowner in the region would suddenly decide their orange grove was worth 10 times what it was actually worth. They were right to be careful. The operation was one of the most elaborate corporate land grabs in American history. By 1965, Disney had quietly purchased around 27,000 acres, roughly twice the size of Manhattan, for approximately $5 million. Reporters eventually started asking questions. When the secret finally got out, the Orlando Sentinel broke the story in October 1965, and the region hasn't been the same since. Walt's vision and his exit. Walt Disney made the public announcement himself in November 1965, alongside Florida Governor Hayden Burns at a press conference in Orlando. He talked about the resort, the theme park, and his city of the future. He described monorails, climate-controlled streets, and a civic center unlike anything that existed. The press was captivated. So was Florida's government, which moved quickly to give Disney something unprecedented: the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Created in 1967 through an act of the Florida legislature, Reedy Creek essentially made Disney its own governing authority. The company could build its own roads, utilities, fire department, and infrastructure without going through the usual local government channels. It could issue bonds, set building codes, and operate with a level of self-determination that most municipalities don't have. It was, and still is, a remarkable arrangement. One that gave Disney autonomy that no private entertainment company had ever had before, and that many believe no private company should ever have. Walt, however, never saw any of it get built. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer after a visit to the doctor in late 1966, and the prognosis was not good. He died on December 15, 1966, of lung cancer, just weeks after Reedy Creek's legislative groundwork was beginning. He was 65 years old. The man who conceived the entire project didn't live to watch a single shovel break ground in Florida. His brother Roy, who had spent decades as the financial and business backbone of the company, while Walt handled the creative side, had been planning to retire. Instead, he decided to stay and see the project through. Roy was 73 years old when construction began in earnest. He didn't have to do it. He chose to. Roy Disney oversaw the construction of what was then being called Disney World, and insisted it be renamed Walt Disney World in his brother's honor. He wanted Walt's name on the building, on the gate, associated permanently with what they'd both worked toward. He got it. Building the Kingdom. Construction began in earnest in 1969. The sheer scale of what was being built was staggering. Not just a theme park, but an entire resort infrastructure, including hotels, roads, a monorail system, and an underground network of tunnels beneath the Magic Kingdom called the Utilidors. Those tunnels deserve a moment. Walt had been bothered at Disneyland by seeing costumed characters walking through the wrong land. A cowboy cutting through Tomorrowland, for instance, breaking the immersive experience he'd carefully designed. The Florida park would fix that problem before it ever existed. Beneath the Magic Kingdom, a full level of service tunnels allowed cast members, supplies, and equipment to move invisibly from area to area. Guests walking through Fantasyland above would never see a Tomorrowland character, because that character would travel underground. The Magic Kingdom itself was built on an artificial platform raised above the natural ground level precisely to accommodate those tunnels. The natural terrain of Central Florida sits low, and the water table is high, so the entire structure required an elevated base. Millions of tons of soil were moved. A man-made lake called Seven Seas Lagoon was excavated along the park's western edge, and Bay Lake was dredged and cleaned of the decades of sediment that had accumulated in it. Getting the land ready for construction was, in some ways, a bigger engineering project than the buildings themselves. The workforce at its peak numbered in the thousands, and the scale of logistical coordination required to manage all of it was something Disney had to essentially invent as they went. There was no template for building something this large. The opening day ceremony on October 1st, 1971 was notably low-key compared to Disneyland's chaotic 1955 launch, which Walt had called Black Sunday, due to all the things that went wrong. Disney World's opening went smoothly, though the attendance on that first day was around 10,000 guests, far lower than the park could accommodate. The company had deliberately kept it quiet, wary of another overcrowded disaster. Within the first year, attendance was already climbing toward 10 million annually. The resort that opened in 1971 had one theme park, two hotels, the Contemporary and the Polynesian, and the monorail connecting them. It was a start. A big, expensive, carefully engineered start, but still just the foundation of what was eventually coming. Roy Disney was present for the dedication. He had been there from the beginning and stayed until the end. He died just 2 months after opening day, on December 20th, 1971. He was 78 years old. Both brothers were gone, and the thing they'd built together was just getting started. The turbulent years. After Roy's death, Disney World entered a strange period. The company didn't have a clear successor in the way the parks needed, and a rotating cast of executives cycled through leadership. The creative direction drifted. Cost-cutting became a priority in ways that weren't always visible to guests, but were very visible internally. Walt's original Epcot concept, the actual city, was quietly shelved after his death because nobody could figure out how to make it work without Walt himself driving it forward. Too ambitious, too expensive, too dependent on the vision of one specific person. Cardwalker and Don Tatum led the company through much of the 1970s, steadying the ship but not dramatically pushing it forward. The park's first decade was successful by almost any measure, but there was a growing sense that Disney wasn't moving fast enough, wasn't innovating the way it had under Walt. Epcot Center eventually opened in October 1982, not as a city, but as a second theme park. Divided into Future World and World Showcase, it was unlike anything else in the theme park industry. Slower, more cerebral, built around ideas rather than franchises. Future World's pavilions were sponsored by major corporations like Exxon, Kraft, and General Motors, each presenting a vision of technology and progress. World Showcase offered a ring of international pavilions, each representing a country through its architecture, food, and culture. The park attracted visitors, but it also baffled many of them. Without a clear central narrative or obvious thrill rides, some guests weren't quite sure what it was supposed to be. By 1984, the company's financial situation and internal politics had reached a genuinely unstable point. A hostile takeover bid from corporate raider Saul Steinberg forced the board to act. Michael Eisner, then at Paramount Pictures, was recruited as CEO. Frank Wells, a former Warner Brothers executive, came in as president. The two complemented each other. Eisner was bold and creatively driven. Wells was measured and operationally focused. Together, they were about to change everything. The Eisner era. Michael Eisner was aggressive, ambitious, and willing to spend. Under his tenure, Walt Disney World grew at a pace the company hadn't seen since its opening. Disney MGM Studios, later renamed Disney's Hollywood Studios, opened in May 1989, capitalizing on the public's fascination with Hollywood and the film industry. It was built partly as a functioning production studio, though the production side was always more marketing concept than operational reality. Disney's Animal Kingdom, the fourth and largest of the parks by land area, opened in April 1998, blending traditional safari wildlife with themed lands and conservation messaging. New hotels went up at a rapid pace throughout the late 1980s and 1990s. Disney wanted guests to stay on property, spend money in Disney stores and restaurants, and never feel the need to venture off into the rest of Orlando. To make that possible, they needed accommodation at every price point, from the Deluxe Grand Floridian, which opened in 1988 as the resort's flagship hotel, to the value resorts that started coming online in the early 1990s. By the late 1990s, Disney operated well over a dozen hotels on its property, with thousands of rooms. Eisner also understood how the company's film output and its parks could feed each other. The animated renaissance of the late 1980s and 1990s, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, generated not just box office revenue, but characters, stories, and intellectual property that could be turned into park attractions, live shows, and merchandise. The parks became marketing machines for the films, and the films became marketing machines for the parks. It was a feedback loop that worked exceptionally well for about a decade. Not everything under Eisner went according to plan. Euro Disney, later renamed Disneyland Paris, opened in April 1992 to immediate financial difficulties and considerable cultural skepticism from Europeans who weren't entirely convinced they wanted a piece of American corporate entertainment dropped into the French countryside. The planned Disney America historical theme park, proposed for a site in Virginia, was abandoned in 1994 after fierce opposition from local communities, historians, and preservation groups who didn't want theme park infrastructure near Civil War battlefields. Closer to home, the death of Frank Wells in a helicopter crash in April 1994 destabilized the executive partnership that had driven the company's success. Eisner's subsequent conflict with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who felt he'd been promised Wells's position and didn't get it, led to an expensive lawsuit that Disney eventually settled for hundreds of millions of dollars. The creative output of the late 1990s suffered noticeably during the fallout. Still, for Walt Disney World specifically, the Eisner years turned a two-park resort into a full destination. By the time he left, the resort had 4 theme parks, 2 water parks, dozens of hotels, and a shopping and entertainment complex that had grown from an afterthought into a significant draw in its own right. Into the 21st century. Eisner eventually departed in 2005, pushed out under pressure from the board, with Roy E. Disney, Walt's nephew, among his most vocal critics. Bob Iger took over as CEO and almost immediately proved he had a very different approach to running the company. Where Eisner had often developed ideas internally and was protective of the Disney brand to a fault, Iger went shopping. Pixar was acquired in 2006, Marvel Entertainment followed in 2009, Lucasfilm in 2012, 21st Century Fox in 2019. Each of those acquisitions eventually showed up in the parks in some form. Cars Land had already transformed Disney California Adventure. At Walt Disney World, the more significant investments came in the form of entire new lands rather than single attractions. Pandora, the world of Avatar, opened in Animal Kingdom in May 2017, converting a long-neglected section of the park called Camp Mini Mickey into one of the most visually striking environments in any theme park anywhere. The bioluminescent nighttime version of Pandora, in particular, became something guests genuinely talked about in a way that individual rides rarely generate. Star Wars: Galaxy's Edge opened in Hollywood Studios in August 2019. 2 years in the making and built on 14 acres of previously undeveloped land on the park's back edge, it was designed down to the smallest detail. The signage, the alien languages on the walls, the food and drinks, to feel like a real place in the Star Wars universe. The 2 main attractions, Millennium Falcon, Smuggler's Run, and Rise of the Resistance, represented different approaches to theme park technology. The latter in particular was widely considered one of the most ambitious ride experiences ever built, combining live actors, multiple vehicles, screen sequences, and practical sets in a way that had genuinely never been done before. The Marvel situation at Walt Disney World was, and remains, complicated. Universal Orlando held pre-existing licensing rights to use Marvel characters in its Florida theme park, which meant Disney, despite owning Marvel, couldn't deploy those characters at its own Florida resort. Disney found ways around it at other locations globally, but in Florida, the arrangement stood. It was a strange result. The company owning some of the most valuable intellectual property in entertainment couldn't use it at home. The pandemic and what followed. In March 2020, Walt Disney World closed for the first time in its history. Not for a hurricane, not for a maintenance period, but because of a global pandemic. The closure lasted 116 days. When the parks reopened in July 2020, they did so at reduced capacity, with mandatory masks, physical distancing, and none of the parades, fireworks shows, or character meet and greets that had been standard parts of the experience for decades. It was a version of Disney World, technically, but it didn't feel like one to anyone who'd been before. FastPass, the free ride reservation system that had let guests book specific attraction times in advance, was suspended during the reopening. When the question of what would replace it finally got an answer in 2021, that answer was Genie Plus, a paid service. Guests would now pay extra per visit to access the line-skipping benefits that had previously been included with admission. For many longtime Disney visitors, it felt like a line had been crossed. The broader pricing trajectory at Walt Disney World had been a slow escalation for years, but the post-pandemic version became a recurring source of public frustration. Ticket prices, hotel costs, food prices within the parks, and the growing ecosystem of paid add-ons, Genie Plus, individual lightning lanes for the most popular attractions, paid parking, all contributed to the sense that a family trip to Disney World had become something that required serious financial planning in a way it hadn't before. Whether that reflected post-pandemic cost pressures, deliberate crowd management strategy, or simply the company charging what the market would bear is probably all three at once. Bob Chapek, who had replaced Iger just weeks before the pandemic hit in early 2020, bore the brunt of both the pandemic's operational fallout and the public's reaction to the pricing and policy changes that followed. He was ousted by the board in November 2022, and Bob Iger returned to the CEO role in a move that genuinely surprised the entertainment industry. Iger's return was framed as temporary, which is a sentence that has been repeated several times since. The Reedy Creek Battle. In 2022, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis moved to dissolve the Reedy Creek Improvement District following a public dispute with Disney over Florida's Parental Rights and Education Act, dubbed the Don't Say Gay bill by critics. Disney's then CEO Bob Chapek initially stayed quiet, then issued a statement opposing the legislation after significant pressure from employees and the public. The governor's response was swift and pointed. Reedy Creek, the arrangement that had governed Disney's Florida land since 1967, was restructured and rebranded as the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District in 2023. The most significant change was that its governing board would now be appointed by the governor rather than by Disney. Control over the entity that managed roads, utilities, fire protection, and building codes across Disney's property was effectively transferred out of the company's hands. Disney responded with a lawsuit, and the broader legal and political conflict played out in courts and press conferences for the better part of 2 years. Disney argued its First Amendment rights had been violated, that the state had used governmental power to punish the company for speech. Florida argued it was simply reforming an outdated and inappropriate special district. The courts became the arena. The dispute eventually wound down after negotiations between Disney and the new oversight board, with the two sides reaching agreements on development and infrastructure. It ended less with a definitive winner than with both parties deciding the public battle was costing more than the underlying issue was worth. But the episode made clear that the half-century arrangement between Disney and Florida's government was no longer something either party would take for granted, and that the unique autonomy Walt Disney had secured back in 1967 was no longer untouchable. What it actually is now. Walt Disney World today comprises 4 theme parks, 2 water parks, more than 30 resort hotels, a shopping and entertainment district called Disney Springs, a wide-reaching transportation network including the original monorail that Walt imagined back in the 1960s, and a surface area large enough to contain most mid-sized American cities. The footprint Walt assembled through shell companies in 1965 is still almost entirely intact. The Magic Kingdom remains the most visited theme park on Earth year after year by a significant margin. Epcot has undergone a multi-year transformation since 2019, adding new lands and attractions while slowly phasing out some of its older pavilions and experiences. Hollywood Studios reorganized itself largely around Star Wars and Toy Story. Animal Kingdom mixes safari wildlife with themed storytelling in ways that make it the most singular park on the property. The one that, if you described it to someone who'd never heard of it, would sound like something nobody should have been able to build. The workforce, Disney calls them cast members, numbers roughly 77,000 at the Florida resort alone, making it one of the largest single-site employers in the United States. The economic footprint of the resort on Central Florida is enormous, accounting for a significant portion of the region's tourism revenue and tax base, which makes the political relationship between Disney and the state government something that neither side can simply walk away from, no matter how strained it gets. Walt Disney once said that Disneyland would never be finished as long as there was imagination left in the world. Walt Disney World, which he never saw built, seems to be operating on the same principle. The swamp is long gone. What replaced it has been running for over 50 years, and it shows no signs of stopping. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.